Close your eyes now, if you are able. Let your body grow a little heavier. Let the weight of the day settle gently into the surface beneath you, like sediment drifting slowly to the floor of a still and ancient lake. There is nothing you need to do right now, nothing you need to remember, nothing that requires your attention. You are here in this quiet place, and in a moment we are going to travel somewhere together. Not a frightening place, not a dramatic one, but a distant one, a place separated from you by years and oceans, and the slow accumulation of time. We are going to drift back very gently to a season that has already passed, to a world that was, for a brief and transformative period, learning something about itself that it had not known before. Breathe in slowly and breathe out. Let your shoulders fall. Let your hands rest. And if this voice helps you find the rest you are looking for tonight, consider subscribing to Plague Lullaby. But only if you are still awake, only if the words have not yet dissolved into the comfortable darkness behind your eyelids. We will be here when you return. We are always here, patient and unhurried, with another long and quiet story waiting for you. But for now, let us begin. Let us drift back to the year 2019, to the middle of autumn, to a city in the center of China that most of the world had never thought much about, a city of 11 million people going about their ordinary lives, beside a wide and quietly moving river, beneath skies that were growing cooler as the season turned. The city was called Wuhan, and something very slowly and very quietly was beginning there. Wuhan is a city that had existed in various forms and under various names for more than 3,000 years, sitting at the confluence of the Yangtze and Han rivers in the province of Hubei, a place of trade and transport, of bridges and industry, of universities and hospitals, and the comfortable rhythms of daily life that belong to any large and established city. In the autumn of 2019, it was home to roughly 11 million people, which made it among the largest cities in China, and, by extension, among the largest cities in the world, though it occupied a quieter place, in the imagination of people living elsewhere, than the great coastal metropolises of Shanghai or Beijing. The city had its markets, its schools, its hospitals, its crowded transit networks, its restaurants where workers gathered in the evenings, its streets full of the particular sounds and smells of a city that is always, always in motion. Wuhan was also, by the autumn of 2019, home to a number of significant scientific institutions, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology, a research facility operated by the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which had spent years studying the behavior and genetics of coronaviruses, a family of viruses that had long been known to circulate in bat populations across southern and central Asia. It is worth noting, gently and without alarm, that the presence of this institute would become significant in the years that followed. Not because of anything proven, but because of questions that would accumulate slowly, like dust on a forgotten shelf, over the course of an ongoing and unresolved global conversation. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In the autumn of 2019, the Wuhan Institute of Virology was simply one of many institutions in a city that was simply going about its life. And somewhere in that city, in a moment that no one recorded, that no one witnessed in any way that would later be retrievable, something very small and very consequential was beginning to happen. A virus belonging to a large and well-studied family called the coronaviruses was making contact with a human being. And that contact, so ordinary in the biological sense, so unremarkable in its mechanics, was the first thread of a story that would eventually reach every country on Earth. Coronaviruses, as a family of viruses, had been known to science since the 1960s, when researchers examining samples under electron microscopes noticed a group of particles with a distinctive appearance. They were surrounded by a kind of halo of spike-like projections that, to the scientists observing them, resembled the corona of the sun during a solar eclipse, and so the family was named accordingly. They were, for most of the 20th century, considered relatively unremarkable agents of the common cold, responsible for a portion of the mild respiratory illnesses that circulate through human populations every winter, notable primarily for their tendency to cause runny noses, mild sore throats, and the kind of low-grade malaise that sends people to bed for a day or two before they recover entirely. In the early years of the 21st century, however, two members of this family demonstrated that the group was capable of something more serious. In 2002 and 2003, a coronavirus called SARS-CoV, severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, emerged in the Guangdong province of southern China and spread to more than 24 countries, infecting over 8,000 people and killing approximately 800 before it was contained. An outbreak that generated significant alarm within the global public health community and led to substantial investment in research into the behavior and transmission of coronaviruses. A decade later, in 2012, another coronavirus called MERS-CoV, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus, appeared in Saudi Arabia and demonstrated an even higher case fatality rate, though it spread less efficiently between people and remained more geographically concentrated. These two outbreaks established a kind of quiet awareness within the scientific community that the coronavirus family bore watching, that somewhere in the vast reservoir of animal populations, primarily bats, researchers believed, though often with intermediate hosts acting as bridges to human exposure, there might be additional members of this family capable of making the jump into human beings. In 2019, in Wuhan, that awareness would prove to have been well-founded. The virus that would become known as SARS-CoV-2 belonged to the same broad family as its predecessors, though it had certain characteristics, particularly in how efficiently it spread between people, that would make it far more consequential than either SARS or MERS had been. It carried, in its genetic structure, a particular feature called a furin cleavage site, a molecular characteristic that allowed it to more easily enter human cells, and it possessed a spike protein of unusual affinity for the ACE2 receptors present in the cells lining the human respiratory tract. These are quiet biological facts, offered here not to alarm, but simply to describe the nature of what was beginning, with great patience and no awareness of its own significance, to move through the world. The first known cluster of cases consistent with what would later be identified as COVID-19 is believed, by epidemiologists reviewing the available records, to have occurred sometime around mid-November of 2019, though the earliest confirmed cases documented in retrospective analyses of hospital records and biological samples appear to cluster in late November and early December of that year. On the 31st of December, 2019, the China office of the World Health Organization received a notification from the Chinese National Health Commission regarding a cluster of cases of pneumonia of unknown cause in Wuhan, Hubei province, noting that the cases appeared to be connected in some way to the Huanan seafood wholesale market, a large wet market near the center of the city where live animals and fresh seafood were sold alongside vegetables and other goods. The Huanan market had been operating for years in the way that wet markets have operated throughout much of Asia for centuries. Open-air stalls, close contact between vendors and animals, the particular sensory environment of a working market, with all of its textures and sounds, and the quiet, constant movement of people going about the business of buying and selling the ordinary things that sustain daily life. By the time the World Health Organization received that notification, at the end of December, dozens of people who had visited or worked at the Wuhan market had already been hospitalized with a form of pneumonia that was not responding to the treatments typically used for bacterial pneumonia, which suggested to the physicians and public health officials handling their cases that the cause was likely a viral one. Chinese health authorities had, on the 31st of December, informed the WHO that they were investigating, and on the 8th of January 2020, Chinese scientists publicly identified the causative agent as a novel coronavirus, a new member of the family previously unknown in human beings, which had not appeared in any scientific database or surveillance system. The sequence of its genome was shared internationally on the 11th of January 2020, a piece of scientific generosity that would prove enormously important in the months that followed because it gave researchers around the world the information they needed to begin working on diagnostic tests and, eventually, potential vaccines and treatments. Meanwhile, in Wuhan, the hospitals were growing quieter and fuller at the same time. Quieter in that people were not speaking much about what was happening. Fuller in that the wards designed for respiratory illness were receiving more patients than was usual for the season. During this period, in the first weeks of January 2020, the world outside Wuhan was watching with a kind of attentive, but not yet alarmed, interest, the way one might watch a distant weather system that has not yet been confirmed as a storm. The World Health Organization issued its first disease outbreak news report on the 5th of January 2020, noting the cluster of pneumonia cases, acknowledging the identification of a novel coronavirus, and describing the situation as one requiring monitoring. Though at that moment, the available evidence did not clearly indicate sustained human-to-human transmission, meaning the possibility that the virus was spreading from person to person in the community, rather than simply from animals to individual humans at the market, had not yet been established with certainty. By the middle of January, however, the picture was beginning to shift. On the 13th of January, officials in Thailand confirmed a case of the novel coronavirus in a traveller who had arrived from Wuhan, which was the first recorded case outside of China, and the first indication that the virus had already crossed an international border. On the 15th of January, Japan confirmed a case. By the 20th of January, Dr. Zhong Nanshan, a respected Chinese epidemiologist who had been prominent in the response to the SARS outbreak in 2003, and whose public statements carried considerable weight with the Chinese public, confirmed on national television that the virus was indeed spreading between people. This confirmation, delivered with the measured gravity of a scientist, speaking a truth that could not responsibly be withheld, changed the tenor of the situation in China almost immediately. Within days, Wuhan had been placed under a quarantine of extraordinary scale. On the 23rd of January 2020, the Chinese government effectively sealed the city of 11 million people, suspending outbound flights and trains and buses, requesting that residents remain in their homes, a measure that had no clear precedent in modern public health history, an act of containment so sweeping and so sudden that it generated almost immediate debate among public health officials and governments around the world about both its feasibility and its wisdom. Over the next days and weeks, the quarantine expanded to encompass neighboring cities in Hubei province, eventually affecting tens of millions of people. The soft hum of daily life in one of the world's largest urban regions had been paused, not violently or dramatically, but with a kind of administrative inevitability that arrived before most people had fully processed what was happening. It is worth pausing here in the way that one pauses in a long and quiet piece of music, simply to note the strangeness and the weight of those early weeks, the way in which a situation that was, to most of the world, still a distant and somewhat abstract news item was already, for the people living inside it, a profound and disorienting transformation of ordinary life. In Wuhan, in those weeks of January and early February 2020, the streets that had been busy with the movement of 11 million lives grew quiet in a way that had no precedent in the memory of anyone living there. The markets closed. The restaurants went dark. The schools that had been preparing to reopen after the Lunar New Year holiday remained shut. The Lunar New Year, which falls in late January and is the most significant holiday in the Chinese calendar, a time of family reunion and collective celebration, of travel and feasting and the bright noise of fireworks, passed in 2020 in an atmosphere of unusual stillness. With the celebrations cancelled or muted, families separated by the quarantine orders, the traditional gatherings that would have brought people together across the city and across the country, replaced by telephone calls and the particular loneliness of watching a holiday arrive and pass without the rituals that had always accompanied it. Inside the hospitals, the situation was intensifying in ways that the medical staff working in them would later describe in interviews and memoirs and official reports as an experience unlike anything their training had prepared them for. The novel coronavirus, which would formally receive the name SARS-CoV-2 in February of 2020, with the disease it caused designated COVID-19 by the World Health Organizations, produced in a significant portion of the patients who developed serious illness, a condition in which the lungs became progressively less able to perform their function, with fluid accumulating in the alveoli and the body's inflammatory response, sometimes intensifying in ways that created additional damage alongside the direct effects of the viral infection itself. The physicians managing these patients were working with a pathogen they had never encountered, with treatments that were experimental, with protective equipment that was in short supply, and with a ward census that was growing faster than the available resources could comfortably accommodate. It is worth noting that among the healthcare workers of Wuhan in those early weeks was a young ophthalmologist named Li Wenliang, who had, in late December 2019, sent a private message to colleagues in a medical chat group warning them that a SARS-like illness appeared to be circulating and recommending precautions. He had been summoned by local police and required to sign a statement acknowledging that his warning had been improper and that he had been disrupting social order, a requirement that he fulfilled. And that would become, in the months that followed, a quietly devastating illustration of the tension between early transparency and institutional caution. Li Wenliang subsequently contracted COVID-19 while treating patients developed serious illness and died on the 7th of February 2020 at the age of 33. His death was mourned across China and around the world, not with the noise of outrage, though that was present too, but with something quieter and more lasting, a sorrow that attached itself to his name and remained there, a soft and permanent memorial to the cost of silence in the early days of an emerging disease. By the end of January 2020, the world outside China was moving from attentive observation to something closer to active concern, and the machinery of global public health, which had been designed in the years following earlier outbreaks to respond to precisely this kind of situation, was beginning to move with increasing speed. On the 30th of January, 2020, the World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus declared the novel coronavirus outbreak a public health emergency of international concern, the highest level of alarm available under the international health regulations, a designation that had been used only 5 times previously in the history of the WHO's current regulatory framework, including during the H1N1 influenza pandemic of 2009 and the Ebola outbreak in West Africa between 2014 and 2016. The declaration was intended to activate a coordinated international response to signal to governments and health authorities around the world that the situation required immediate and serious attention, and to trigger mechanisms for resource sharings and technical assistance that had been established precisely for moments like this one. In the days surrounding this declaration, countries around the world were beginning to impose their own responses to the growing number of cases appearing outside China. Japan, Thailand, South Korea, and the United States had all confirmed cases, and several nations were beginning to restrict travel from China, close embassies, and advise their citizens against non-essential travel to Wuhan and Hubei province. The United States government, under the administration of President Donald Trump, declared a public health emergency on the 31st of January and began requiring that American citizens returning from Hubei province undergo mandatory quarantine, a measure that represented the first use of federal quarantine authority in the United States since the 1960s. Other governments were watching the situation closely, consulting with their own public health advisors, reviewing their pandemic preparedness plans, and beginning the complicated process of deciding how much disruption to ordinary economic and social life was justified by a threat whose full dimensions were not yet clear. This uncertainty, the uncertainty about how far the virus had already spread, how efficiently it transmitted, how severe it was in the general population rather than in the hospitalized cases that were most visible, was the defining feature of those early weeks, a kind of epistemic fog that settled over the decisions being made by governments and institutions that were trying to respond to a situation they could not yet fully see. Meanwhile, in the cities and towns and villages of Hubei province, and beginning now in other provinces of China, in South Korea, in Japan, in Iran, in Italy, in the United States, ordinary people were having their first encounters with a virus that had no interest in their plans or their fears, that moved through the air and across surfaces and between people engaged in the unremarkable transactions of daily life, silent and invisible, and in many cases, completely without the drama that the word pandemic would eventually come to carry. The virus traveled, as viruses always have, not by intention, but by opportunity, moving along the same routes that people moved. Through airports and train stations, across the invisible lines that separate one nation's territory from another, into the close quarters of offices and restaurants and family gatherings, and all the ordinary shared spaces in which modern human life takes place. It traveled in respiratory droplets, in the fine aerosols produced by breathing and speaking and singing, in the particular intimacy of indoor spaces with limited ventilation, where people spent extended periods of time in one another's company. In late January and early February, the virus arrived in Italy, specifically in the northern region of Lombardy, which was one of the most economically productive regions in Europe, a place of factories and design houses, and well-regarded hospitals, and the particular dense sociability of northern Italian urban life. The first locally transmitted case in Italy was confirmed on the 21st of February 2020 in the small town of Codogno in the province of Lodi, and within days the Italian authorities had confirmed additional cases in the surrounding area and had begun implementing containment measures, closing schools and businesses in the affected zone, asking residents to remain at home. The situation in Lombardy escalated with a speed that surprised even experienced public health officials. Within 2 weeks of the first confirmed case, the northern Italian healthcare system, which was by any standard one of the better resourced systems in the world, was facing a patient surge of a kind it had not previously experienced, with intensive care units filling rapidly and hospitals beginning to make difficult decisions about the allocation of critical resources. The images and accounts that emerged from Lombardy in late February and March of 2020, the overflowing hospitals, the military trucks moving through Bergamo at night because the city's cemeteries could not manage the volume of deaths, the physicians in protective equipment working exhausting and unrelenting shifts, reached people around the world and contributed to a shift in the collective understanding of what this outbreak was and what it might become. In Tehran, in the same period, the Islamic Republic of Iran was experiencing a severe outbreak that had, it would emerge, already resulted in the deaths of several senior officials and was spreading through a population whose government was responding with what independent observers characterized as insufficient transparency. In South Korea, an outbreak connected to a religious group called the Shincheonji Church of Jesus had resulted in a rapid increase in cases, but the South Korean government's response, swift, comprehensive contact tracing, widespread testing, and transparent public communication, would later be studied as a model of effective early outbreak management. Over the next several weeks, the map of COVID-19 spread would fill in with new dots of red in nearly every country on the globe, each dot representing not a statistic, but a person. Someone's grandmother, someone's colleague, someone's neighbor. Encountering a virus that was, in the early spring of 2020, still very much in the process of introducing itself to the world. On the 11th of March 2020, the World Health Organization made an announcement that had been anticipated for several days by anyone following the accumulating case counts from around the world. Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus declared COVID-19 a pandemic, using that specific and weighted word for the first time, acknowledging that the novel coronavirus had achieved the kind of global spread that could no longer be described as an outbreak contained within a specific region, but had to be understood as a worldwide health event of a scale that had not been seen since the influenza pandemic of 1918. The announcement was made in the calm, deliberate tone appropriate to an institution whose function is to communicate public health information without either minimizing or sensationalizing. And it was received around the world with a range of responses that reflected the particular mixture of disbelief and preparedness and fear that had been building for weeks. In the United States, the week of the 11th of March was marked by a series of events that would remain in the memory of those who lived through them as a set of markers by which the before and after were measured. On the 11th, the National Basketball Associations suspended its season when a player on the Utah Jazz tested positive. On the 12th, the National Collegiate Athletic Association cancelled its annual basketball tournament. Schools and universities across the country announced closures. States of emergency were declared in dozens of states, and people, responding to a combination of public health guidance and personal anxiety, began purchasing in quantities that emptied supermarket shelves of items that had previously seemed entirely unremarkable and inexhaustible. Flour, dried pasta, canned goods, and, notably, toilet paper, the shortage of which would become a minor but persistent symbol of the particular human response to uncertainty, the desire to acquire and hold close the things that feel like fundamentals when the future becomes unclear. The National Basketball Association's decision, because it was sudden and public and comprehensible in the way that sports schedules are comprehensible, carried a peculiar symbolic weight. It made the pandemic feel real in a way that case counts, and WHO announcements had not quite managed, providing a concrete and familiar disruption through which the abstract threat became suddenly present. Over the next 10 days, most of the developed world entered some form of lockdown or severe restriction of movement and gathering, with governments issuing stay-at-home orders, closing non-essential businesses, restricting travel between regions, and asking their populations to accept a transformation of daily life that had no clear precedent in peacetime history. It was the middle of March, the season that, in the Northern Hemisphere, is associated with the first warmth after winter, with the gradual return of light and the opening of windows and the resumption of outdoor life. Instead, the world was going indoors, closing its doors, and trying to understand what had arrived. The experience of lockdown, that word, with its associations of prisons and containment, which had never previously been applied to the daily lives of entire civilian populations, was different in its texture and its weight, depending on where one lived and in what circumstances. In the cities of Europe and North America, where many workers could transition to remote work, using the digital infrastructure that had been built over the preceding decades, the lockdown was experienced as a strange mixture of inconvenience and intimacy, a compulsory slowing down that removed the external structure of commuting and office hours, and the small social rituals of working life, and replaced them with something quieter, more uncertain, and for some people genuinely difficult, and for others unexpectedly peaceful. People baked bread for reasons that seemed to have more to do with the need for purposeful physical activity than with any shortage of bread. They walked slowly around their neighborhoods in the early spring light. They attended virtual meetings from spare bedrooms and kitchen tables. They called relatives more frequently than they had before. For others, the experience of lockdown was one of genuine hardship. For the workers in essential industries who could not stay home, for those in overcrowded housing who had no private space in which to isolate, for those living with domestic violence whose situation became more dangerous when the outside world closed its doors, for those whose income depended on industries that had been shuttered overnight and who had no savings to bridge the gap. The virus itself, meanwhile, was revealing its particular characteristics with increasing clarity as the number of cases grew into the hundreds of thousands. It was most dangerous, the emerging data showed, in older people and in those with certain underlying health conditions: heart disease, diabetes, obesity, compromised immune function. While in younger and healthier people, it caused a wide range of experiences, from no symptoms at all to mild illness, to, in a smaller proportion of cases, severe disease. The characteristic pattern of COVID-19 pneumonia. The gradual deterioration over the course of a week or more. The sudden worsening that could occur in the second week of illness. The acute respiratory distress that required mechanical ventilation in the most serious cases was becoming familiar to intensive care physicians around the world who were sharing information rapidly through the new networks of urgent scientific communication that the pandemic had called into being. In the United States, by the end of March 2020, the case count had surpassed 100,000, making the country, measured by raw number, not by population-adjusted rate, the most affected nation in the world, a distinction that would become a subject of extensive analysis and debate in the months and years that followed. During this period of the early pandemic, in the spring of 2020, the scientific community entered a phase of extraordinary and somewhat unprecedented activity driven by the combination of urgency and global information sharing that the WHO pandemic declaration had catalyzed. Researchers in dozens of countries were working simultaneously, and often in formal or informal collaboration, to understand the basic biology of the virus, to develop reliable diagnostic tests, to identify existing drugs that might reduce the severity of illness, and to begin the early stages of vaccine development. Work that under normal circumstances would have unfolded over years, constrained by the sequential processes of research funding, institutional review, clinical trial design, regulatory evaluation, and manufacturing scale-up, but which was now proceeding in parallel with unprecedented resources and attention directed at every stage simultaneously. The vaccine development story that would unfold over the course of 2020 would later be described as one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of medicine, and it is worth narrating slowly because it deserves the attention of unhurried description. Among the many approaches being explored, two particular technological platforms were at the center of the effort that would ultimately produce the first authorized vaccines. The messenger RNA platform, which had been in development for years as a potential approach to vaccine design, but had not yet resulted in any approved human vaccine, and the viral vector platform, which used a modified harmless virus to deliver genetic instructions into human cells. The companies most prominently associated with the mRNA approach were Pfizer-BioNTech, a collaboration between the American pharmaceutical company Pfizer and the German biotechnology company BioNTech, which had been founded in 2008 by the husband and wife research team of Ugur Shahin and Özlem Türeci, who had spent their careers working on mRNA-based cancer treatments, and Moderna, an American biotechnology company that had been founded in 2010, and whose name was itself a quiet reference to the technology derived from a combination of the words modified and RNA. Both companies moved with a speed that reflected both the urgency of the situation and the particular advantage of their platform. mRNA vaccines can be designed rapidly once the genetic sequence of a target virus is known, because the vaccine is essentially a set of instructions in a molecular language that the body's own cellular machinery can read and act upon, rather than a biological product that must be grown, harvested, and processed. China shared the genetic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 on the 11th of January 2020, and within days, both BioNTech and Moderna had designed the mRNA sequences that would form the basis of their vaccine candidates, initiating what would become one of the most closely watched and fastest moving chapters in the history of pharmaceutical development. The months between March and December of 2020 moved with a strange double rhythm. slow and suspended in the experience of daily life, under restrictions, and fast and compressed in the experience of scientific and political events. The pandemic unfolded differently in different parts of the world, shaped by the particular characteristics of each country's health system, demographic profile, government response, cultural norms around social contact, and material conditions, making any single narrative of the period necessarily incomplete. A set of partial glimpses into an event that was simultaneously local and global, intimate and vast. In the United States, the spring wave of 2020 struck hardest in New York City, where the density of population and the particular patterns of urban life in a city of 8 million people created conditions in which the virus spread rapidly through communities and overwhelmed the city's hospital system with a speed that required the construction of temporary field hospitals in the Jacob Javits Convention Center and the deployment of a United States Navy hospital ship to New York Harbor. In Brazil, under the leadership of President Jair Bolsonaro, who publicly characterized COVID-19 as a minor illness, discouraged the use of protective masks, and resisted the implementation of lockdown measures. The virus moved through one of the world's most densely populated and economically unequal countries, with consequences that would, in the years that followed, produce some of the highest death tolls in the world, concentrated disproportionately in the favelas and working class neighborhoods, where people lived in close quarters, worked in jobs that could not be performed remotely, and had the least access to high-quality medical care. In sub-Saharan Africa, the early predictions of catastrophe, based on modeling that assumed the continent's limited health infrastructure would be unable to manage a large wave of COVID-19 cases, proved partially overstated, for reasons that are still being debated and studied, including the continent's younger demographic profile, the possibility of some cross-reactive immunity from previous exposure to other coronaviruses, and the effectiveness of the social networks and community health infrastructure that African nations had developed through decades of experience managing other infectious diseases. Over the Northern Hemisphere summer of 2020, as restrictions were relaxed in many countries, the virus continued to circulate, producing new waves in places that had believed themselves to be moving past the worst of it, revealing the fundamental difficulty of managing a pathogen that spread asymptomatically in a significant proportion of carriers, and that could reseed itself in communities from a single undetected introduction. By the end of September 2020, the global death toll had crossed 1 million, a number that, when expressed as a statistic, has the flatness of any large number, but which, when understood as 1 million individual people who had each been alive, and then were not, each of them known and mourned by others, carries a weight that numbers alone cannot quite hold. By the autumn of 2020, the world had been living with the novel coronavirus for the better part of a year, and the accumulated weight of that year was beginning to show itself in ways that went beyond the case counts and the death tolls and the daily briefings of government officials standing at lecterns with their graphs and their carefully measured language. There was a tiredness that had settled into the populations of countries that had been under some form of restriction since the early spring. A fatigue that was not simply the fatigue of inconvenience, but something deeper and more complicated. The fatigue of sustained uncertainty, of plans unmade and futures deferred, of relationships maintained through screens, rather than in the physical presence of the people who mattered. The summer of 2020 had offered a brief respite in the Northern Hemisphere, as warmer weather and the movement of social life outdoors had slowed transmission in many places, and some countries had managed to bring their case counts to very low levels through rigorous testing, contact tracing, and quarantine programs. New Zealand, under Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, had declared the elimination of community transmission on multiple occasions, an achievement that reflected both the geographical advantages of an island nation and the effectiveness of a government that had communicated clearly and consistently with its population from the beginning. Australia had pursued a similar strategy, with individual states implementing hard border closures and aggressive contact tracing that kept the virus at low levels for extended periods. South Korea, having managed the early Xinjiang cluster effectively, had continued to apply its comprehensive testing and tracing infrastructure to identify and contain subsequent introductions. But as September gave way to October and October to November, the Northern Hemisphere entered its second pandemic autumn, and the combination of colder weather, which drove social life back indoors, and the accumulated relaxation of cautious behaviors, which had been maintained with considerable effort through the spring and summer, produced what epidemiologists were calling a second wave, a renewed surge of cases across Europe and North America that, in many places, exceeded the peak numbers of the spring. In France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, and the Czech Republic, case counts rose sharply through October, and governments reimposed restrictions that their populations received with a weariness that was different in quality from the bewildered compliance of the spring, less tinged with the novelty of the situation, more plainly reluctant, more openly contested. In the United States, the autumn surge arrived against the backdrop of a presidential election, creating a political context in which the management of the pandemic, mask mandates, school closures, the question of how to balance public health against economic activity, had become deeply entangled with partisan identity in ways that would have lasting consequences for the country's collective response. It is worth noting, with the gentle detachment of retrospect, that this politicization of what was fundamentally a biological and epidemiological situation was not unique to the United States, though it was perhaps more visible there than elsewhere. A reminder that pandemics do not arrive into a social vacuum, but into the existing structures of power, culture, and belief that shape every aspect of human collective life. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of all this political and epidemiological activity, in the laboratories and clinical trial sites that were running the most important pharmaceutical race in living memory, the news was beginning to be good. On the 9th of November 2020, Pfizer and BioNTech announced the preliminary results of their Phase 3 clinical trial of their mRNA vaccine candidate, designated BNT162b2, reporting that the vaccine appeared to be approximately 90% effective at preventing symptomatic COVID-19, a figure that exceeded the expectations of most vaccine scientists, and that was received by those who had been watching this trial closely and who understood what a 90% efficacy figure meant as genuinely extraordinary news. A week later, on the 16th of November, Moderna announced similarly striking results from its own Phase 3 trial, reporting efficacy of approximately 94%. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, developed through a collaboration between Oxford University's Jenner Institute and the British-Swedish pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca, announced its own Phase 3 results in late November, reporting an average efficacy of approximately 70% across different dosing regimens, with the interesting finding that one particular dosing schedule A lower first dose followed by a full second dose appeared to produce higher efficacy than the standard 2 full dose regimen, a result that generated considerable scientific discussion and some regulatory complexity in the months that followed. Russia had already authorized a vaccine called Sputnik V in August 2020, before phase 3 trials had been completed, a decision that generated international debate about the standards of evidence required before a vaccine should be offered to the general public. Those subsequent data suggested that Sputnik V was also reasonably effective at preventing severe illness. China had authorized several domestically developed vaccines from companies including Sinopharm and Sinovac that used the more traditional inactivated virus platform in which killed virus particles stimulate an immune response, and had begun administering these vaccines to certain high priority groups, even before full trial data were available. The United Kingdom became the first Western nation to authorize a COVID-19 vaccine when, on the 2nd of December 2020, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency granted emergency authorization to the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. And on the 8th of December, a 90-year-old woman named Margaret Keenan, a grandmother from Coventry, became the first person in the world to receive a fully authorized COVID-19 vaccine outside of a clinical trial, sitting in a chair in University Hospital Coventry with the quiet dignity of someone who understood, without requiring it to be explained, that she was participating in something significant. The United States Food and Drug Administration issued its own emergency use authorization for the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine on the 11th of December, and the first doses were administered in the United States on the 14th of December 2020, as the country was simultaneously experiencing its worst wave of the pandemic yet, with the daily death toll exceeding 3,000 on multiple days in December, a number that had once seemed unimaginable and had gradually, with the terrible slowness of accumulation, become a terrible ordinary fact of the late pandemic autumn. The distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, once they had been authorized, presented a set of logistical and ethical challenges of unusual complexity, and the way in which those challenges were navigated, or, in many cases, navigated imperfectly, would shape the course of the pandemic in 2021 and beyond in ways that are still being assessed and debated. The mRNA vaccines from Pfizer-BioNTech and Moderna required storage at extremely low temperatures. The Pfizer vaccine, in particular, needed to be kept at approximately minus 70 degrees Celsius, a requirement that placed it beyond the reach of health systems in many lower income countries that lacked the ultra-cold chain infrastructure necessary to maintain such temperatures during transport and storage. This logistical requirement was not simply a technical inconvenience, but a structural factor that contributed to the profound inequality in vaccine access that characterized 2021, during which wealthy nations secured large advance purchase agreements for doses of the most effective vaccines, while many lower-income countries waited for access through the COVAX facility. The Global Vaccine Sharing Initiative, co-led by the WHO, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which faced significant shortfalls relative to its stated goals, as supply constraints and export restrictions limited the flow of doses to participating countries. In wealthy nations, the initial phases of vaccination focused on the highest priority groups: healthcare workers, residents of long-term care facilities, and the oldest and most clinically vulnerable members of the population. And The data that emerged from these campaigns were, by the early spring of 2021, providing clear, real-world confirmation of what the trials had suggested. The vaccines were highly effective at preventing serious illness and death in the populations that received them, and the beginning of vaccination was being followed, with a lag of several weeks corresponding to the time required for immunity to develop by a measurable decline in hospitalizations and deaths in vaccinated groups. In the United Kingdom, where the vaccination campaign had proceeded with notable speed under a centralized purchasing and distribution program, the data by March and April 2021 were showing a dramatic decoupling between case numbers and deaths. The virus was still spreading, but the people most likely to die from it had been substantially protected, and the human cost of each wave of infection had been significantly reduced. In Israel, which had negotiated an agreement with Pfizer-BioNTech to share anonymized population health data in exchange for early access to large quantities of vaccine, the vaccination campaign was proceeding at a speed, measured as a proportion of population vaccinated, that exceeded any other country in the world, and the Israeli data were being watched with intense interest by public health researchers as the most comprehensive real-world demonstration available of what mass vaccination could achieve. Against these encouraging early results, however, was developing a more complicated picture of the virus's behavior, one that would require a significant revision of the initial hopes that vaccination might quickly bring the pandemic to an end. During the winter of 2020 and into the spring of 2021, virologists and genomic surveillance teams around the world were documenting something that had been anticipated from the basic principles of evolutionary biology, but which was arriving with a speed and consequence that demanded urgent attention. The emergence, in multiple locations simultaneously, of new variants of SARS-CoV-2 that carried mutations in the spike protein, the part of the virus that both the immune system and the vaccines had been trained to recognize. In September 2020, genomic sequencing teams in the United Kingdom detected a new variant in samples collected primarily in Kent and London, which carried a number of mutations in the spike protein and appeared, based on the rapidly accumulated epidemiological data, to spread between people significantly more efficiently than the original variant. This variant was designated B.1.1, 7 by scientists and alpha by the WHO's new variant naming system, which used letters of the Greek alphabet to provide accessible and neutral designations for variants of concern, replacing the earlier practice of naming variants after the locations where they were first detected, a practice that had generated legitimate concerns about stigmatization. The alpha variant spread rapidly through the United Kingdom in late 2020 and early 2021, contributing to the severe winter wave that led to the United Kingdom's third national lockdown in January 2021 and was subsequently exported to many other countries. Simultaneously, in South Africa, a different variant designated Beta was being detected that carried different spike protein mutations, including one called E484K that appeared to reduce the effectiveness of some antibody responses. In Brazil, a variant called Gamma, sharing some mutations with Beta, was causing a severe second wave that proved catastrophic for a country whose healthcare system was already under enormous strain and whose government had continued to resist the kinds of coordinated national response that other countries were implementing. These variants and the several additional variants that would follow through 2021 forced a revision of the early hope that the pandemic might follow a straightforward trajectory toward resolution, demonstrating instead that SARS-CoV-2 was actively and continuously evolving in response to the immunological pressure placed on it by natural infection and vaccination, in the way that viruses have always evolved in response to the environments through which they move. The emergence of variants was not a surprise to evolutionary biologists. It was precisely what the principles of natural selection would predict, but its pace and the practical consequences for vaccine effectiveness and pandemic management were sobering, and they underscored the importance of global vaccination as not merely a humanitarian imperative, but an epidemiological one, since continued high-level transmission anywhere in the world provided the conditions necessary for new variants to arise and spread. The spring and summer of 2021 were defined, in the countries with high vaccination rates, by a cautious and uneven return to something that resembled, in outline if not in exact detail, the patterns of life that had existed before the pandemic. Restrictions were lifted gradually, and with considerable variation between jurisdictions. Some governments moved quickly to remove mask mandates and capacity limits once vaccination rates reached certain thresholds, while others proceeded more slowly, extending requirements further into the summer as they awaited broader population coverage, or watched the early signals from more fully reopened environments. In the United States, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued updated guidance in May 2021, stating that fully vaccinated individuals could safely remove their masks in most indoor settings, a change in guidance that was welcomed by many and criticized by others as premature, and which reflected the genuine complexity of communicating public health guidance in a situation where the scientific understanding was still developing in real time. In parts of Asia and the Pacific that had successfully maintained very low case counts through 2020 and into 2021, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, Singapore, Japan. The summer of 2021 brought a new set of challenges as the more transmissible Delta variant, first identified in India in late 2020 and spreading globally through the first half of 2021, began to penetrate even the most carefully managed containment systems and prompted questions about the sustainability of elimination strategies in the face of a more transmissible pathogen. In India itself, the spring of 2021 produced one of the most devastating chapters of the entire pandemic, as the Delta variant drove a wave of illness and death of extraordinary scale, filling hospitals and exhausting oxygen supplies, and cremating the dead in open-air pyres when the indoor facilities could no longer accommodate the volume, a wave that unfolded with a particular visible intensity in the cities of Delhi and Mumbai and Lucknow, and in rural areas that had even less healthcare capacity than the already strained urban centres. The images and accounts from India in April and May 2021 were received around the world with a sorrow that was genuine, and an impulse toward assistance that generated significant international aid and vaccine donation pledges, though the speed and scale of the disaster outpaced many of the responses that were organised. Over the Northern Hemisphere summer of 2021, the Delta variant achieved global dominance, replacing earlier variants in country after country, producing new waves even in highly vaccinated populations, though crucially with a much lower ratio of hospitalizations and deaths to infections than had characterized earlier waves, demonstrating that the vaccines, even as they showed reduced effectiveness against Delta infection, retained significant protection against the severe outcomes that mattered most. Throughout this period, running alongside the acute drama of surges and variants and vaccination campaigns, a quieter and more persistent story was developing that would, in the years that follow, prove to be one of the most significant and complex legacies of the pandemic. The story of what became known as long COVID, or post-COVID condition, a phenomenon in which a substantial proportion of people who had been infected with SARS-CoV-2 found that their symptoms did not resolve in the way that recovery from a respiratory illness was normally expected to proceed, but instead persisted for weeks, months, and in some cases, years after the acute infection had passed. The name long COVID was not coined by a physician or a researcher, but by patients, specifically by a group of people who had been ill since the early months of the pandemic, and who had begun connecting with one another on social media platforms in the spring and summer of 2020, sharing their experiences and their frustration at not being recognized or believed by medical systems that had been oriented in their response to COVID-19 toward the acutely ill and the dying. A researcher and patient named Elisa Perego is often credited with coining the term long COVID in a tweet posted in May 2020, a piece of naming that captured something real and that spread quickly through the community of people experiencing it, giving them a shared vocabulary for a condition that was genuinely new and that the medical establishment was only beginning to recognize. The symptoms that fell under the umbrella of long COVID were diverse, which was itself part of what made the condition so challenging to study and to treat. They included profound fatigue that was not relieved by rest, cognitive difficulties that patients often described as brain fog, a persistent shortness of breath or chest discomfort, headaches, sleep disturbances, joint and muscle pain, and, in some patients, a peculiar symptom called post-exertional malaise, in which physical or cognitive activity led to a worsening of symptoms that could last for days. Some patients reported the persistence of problems with smell and taste. The loss or distortion of these senses had been identified early in the pandemic as a relatively distinctive symptom of acute COVID-19, and others reported cardiac symptoms, including palpitations, and an elevated resting heart rate that interfered significantly with their ability to perform ordinary activities. By the end of 2020, studies from multiple countries were suggesting that somewhere between 10 and 30% of people who had been infected with SARS-CoV-2 were experiencing symptoms that persisted beyond 12 weeks, which, given the enormous global scale of the pandemic, translated to a number of affected individuals in the tens of millions. A burden of chronic illness that had no clear precedent in recent medical history, and that would create lasting challenges for healthcare systems, labor markets, and social support structures in every affected country. The Delta variant's global dominance through the latter half of 2021 established a new baseline for pandemic life, one in which vaccination had significantly reduced the risk of death and severe illness, but had not eliminated transmission, in which mask requirements and testing protocols remained part of daily life in many places, and in which the phrase living with COVID was entering the vocabulary of governments and public health officials as a way of describing a transition from the emergency phase of pandemic response to something more like a managed endemic situation. But just as the trajectory of the pandemic in the final months of 2021 was beginning to feel, in some places, like a slow and irregular approach toward a new normal, the emergence of a new variant in late November 2021, introduced a significant new disruption to that trajectory. The variant, which would be designated Omicron by the WHO, was first detected in genomic sequencing data from South Africa and Botswana in late November 2021, and it carried a number of mutations in the spike protein that was substantially larger than any previous variant. More than 30 mutations in the spike protein alone, a degree of divergence from the original Wuhan strain that was extraordinary and that generated immediate and significant scientific attention. The Omicron variant spread with a speed that exceeded anything that had previously been observed in the pandemic. In South Africa, where it was first detected, it replaced the Delta variant almost completely within a matter of weeks. In Europe, it arrived in early December and within 3 weeks had become the dominant variant in country after country. In the United States, which first detected Omicron cases in early December, it had become dominant nationally by the week of Christmas 2021. The scale of the Omicron wave, measured in raw case numbers, was unlike anything that had come before in the pandemic. In the United States, daily reported case counts in early January 2022 reached levels multiple times higher than any previous peak, a degree of transmission that reflected both the extraordinary efficiency with which Omicron spread and the enormous number of people who had not yet been infected or who had insufficient immunity from prior infection or vaccination to fully resist it. The initial fear was that this wave of cases would translate into a wave of deaths and hospitalizations that would overwhelm healthcare systems once again, and in the early weeks of the wave, as hospitals in many locations filled rapidly. That fear seemed not unreasonable, but the data that emerged over the following weeks told a somewhat different story. Omicron, while dramatically more transmissible than previous variants, appeared to cause less severe illness in the average infected person, producing a lower rate of severe respiratory disease, a lower rate of intensive care admission, and a lower case fatality rate than Delta had produced in comparable populations. This relative attenuation of severity, the reasons for which were debated among scientists, with evidence pointing to both intrinsic characteristics of the variant and the protection provided by prior immunity in substantially vaccinated populations, meant that while the Omicron wave was extremely disruptive, it did not produce mortality on the scale that the raw case numbers had initially suggested it might, and in many countries it moved through the population relatively quickly, burning through susceptible individuals with a speed that left in its wake a substantial portion of the population with some level of natural immunity acquired through infection. In the first months of 2022, as the Omicron wave subsided in the Northern Hemisphere, the conversations within governments and public health institutions about the transition away from emergency pandemic management intensified, driven by the combination of high vaccination rates in wealthy nations, the extensive natural immunity acquired through Omicron infection, the availability of antiviral treatments, including molnupiravir, developed by Merck, and Paxlovid, developed by Pfizer, both of which had received emergency authorization in late 2021 and early 2022, and which significantly reduced the risk of progression to severe illness in high-risk individuals, and the growing political and social pressure to remove the restrictions and requirements that had characterized public life for 2 years. Denmark removed all COVID-19 restrictions on the 1st of February 2022, becoming the first European Union country to do so, and other European nations followed over the subsequent weeks. The United Kingdom removed most of its remaining legal COVID-19 restrictions in February 2022 as well. In the United States, the CDC updated its masking guidance in late February to remove the recommendation for indoor masking in most parts of the country, reflecting a shift in official messaging toward an assessment of individual risk and personal responsibility, rather than universal precautionary measures. Not all countries moved at the same pace. Some, particularly in Asia, maintained stricter protocols longer, and China continued to pursue its zero-COVID strategy of targeted lockdowns, mass testing, and strict quarantine requirements. Well into 2022, a policy that produced extremely low COVID-19 mortality throughout much of the pandemic, but which generated significant social and economic costs, and which was eventually abandoned in December 2022 following widespread public protests that represented one of the largest expressions of popular discontent in China in decades. Throughout this transition period, the scientists and physicians who had been studying long COVID were watching with a mixture of hope and concern. Hope that reduced acute illness would translate into reduced incidence of the persistent symptoms that defined long COVID. Concern that the enormous number of Omicron infections, even if individually less severe on average, would produce new cohorts of long COVID patients in numbers that would create significant challenges for healthcare and social support systems that were already struggling to address the burden accumulated over the preceding 2 years. The evidence that emerged over 2022 suggested a somewhat more complicated picture. Omicron did appear to produce long COVID at a lower rate per infection than earlier variants, particularly in vaccinated individuals, but the sheer volume of Omicron infections meant that the absolute number of new long COVID cases remained very substantial. The World Health Organization formally ended the public health emergency of international concern status for COVID-19 on the 5th of May, 2023, a declaration made by Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, following the recommendation of the International Health Regulations Emergency Committee, which had first convened to assess the outbreak more than 3 years earlier. The announcement was not a declaration that COVID-19 had ended, or that it was no longer a health concern. The WHO was careful to note that the virus continued to circulate, that people continued to die from it, and that long COVID continued to affect millions of people, but rather a reflection of the assessment that the situation had evolved to the point where it no longer met the specific technical criteria for an emergency of international concern under the regulatory framework that governed the WHO's emergency declarations. The transition from pandemic emergency to endemic management was, in its nature, less dramatic than the beginning of the pandemic had been. There was no single moment of resolution, no treaty signing or vaccine triumph that marked a clear before and after, but rather a gradual fading, uneven and incomplete, of the acute emergency into a background condition that remained present, but had ceased to organize every aspect of public and private life around its demands. This transition was accompanied by a process of reckoning, political, scientific, and personal, with what the pandemic had meant and what it had cost. A process that was in many ways still in its earliest stages when the emergency status was lifted. The excess mortality figures that epidemiologists had been calculating throughout the pandemic, measuring the difference between the number of deaths observed during the pandemic period and the number that would have been expected based on pre-pandemic trends, Soncoins, painted a picture of global mortality impact substantially larger than the confirmed COVID-19 death counts alone, because they incorporated deaths from COVID-19 that had not been tested or recorded as such, as well as deaths from other causes that had occurred. Because the pandemic had disrupted healthcare systems, delayed diagnoses, and overwhelmed the capacity of medical institutions to provide care for conditions unrelated to COVID-19. Estimates of global excess mortality over the course of the pandemic varied depending on methodology and data quality, but most credible analyses placed the figure at several million deaths above the approximately 7 million confirmed COVID-19 deaths recorded in official statistics by mid-2023, a gap that reflected both the limitations of death registration systems in many parts of the world and the full systemic impact of a pandemic on a healthcare infrastructure that was designed for ordinary circumstances. In the quiet that followed the WHO's announcement, in the hospitals and laboratories and research institutes where the work had never fully stopped, scientists and physicians were already turning their attention to what came next, to the ongoing burden of long COVID, to the lessons that might be learned for future pandemic preparedness, to the questions about the origins of the virus that remained incompletely answered, and to the individual lives that had been permanently altered by the 3 years through which the world had just traveled. Long COVID, by the time the public health emergency of international concern was lifted in May 2023, had become one of the most intensively studied conditions in the history of medicine. With thousands of research papers published, specialized clinics established in hospitals across dozens of countries, advocacy organizations founded by patients and their families, and policy discussions in legislatures and health ministries around the world about the resources needed to address what some researchers were describing as a new chronic disease epidemic layered on top of the acute pandemic. The WHO had formally defined long COVID, which it designated post-COVID-19 condition in its clinical guidance, as a condition occurring in individuals with a history of probable or confirmed SARS-CoV-2 infection, usually within 3 months of onset of COVID-19, with symptoms lasting at least 2 months, not explained by an alternative diagnosis. The breadth of this definition reflected the genuine heterogeneity of the condition. Long COVID was not a single disease with a single mechanism, but appeared to be an umbrella term covering multiple distinct syndromes that might arise through different biological pathways in different patients, sharing the common feature of temporal association with a SARS-CoV-2 infection and the common experience of persistent and often debilitating symptoms that interfered with daily functioning. Among the hypotheses being investigated by researchers as potential mechanisms underlying long COVID were the persistence of viral material in tissue reservoirs, beyond the resolution of the acute infection, the reactivation of other latent viruses, particularly Epstein-Barr virus, the herpes virus responsible for mononucleosis, which had been found at elevated levels in some long COVID patients, the presence of microclots in the small blood vessels that disrupted oxygen delivery to tissues, dysregulation of the immune system producing chronic low-level inflammation, and damage to the autonomic nervous system, which regulates the body's automatic functions, including heart rate, blood pressure, and digestion. The condition that researchers called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, in which the heart rate rises abnormally when moving from lying to standing, was being diagnosed at elevated rates in long COVID patients and was contributing to the fatigue and exercise intolerance that many of them experienced. The suffering that long COVID produced was real and documented, and in many cases profound. Studies of long COVID patients found significant reductions in quality of life, high rates of inability to work, elevated rates of depression and anxiety, and a consistent frustration with healthcare systems that had, in the early years of the condition, been slow to recognize or take seriously symptoms that were, in many cases, not visible on standard diagnostic tests, and that did not fit neatly into existing diagnostic categories. The parallel with other conditions characterized by persistent symptoms following infection. Myalgic encephalomyelitis, sometimes called chronic fatigue syndrome, which had long struggled for recognition and research funding, was noted by both researchers and advocates, and the visibility and scale of long COVID brought new attention and resources to this broader category of post-infectious conditions that had been underappreciated and underfunded for decades. In this way, one of the unexpected legacies of the COVID-19 pandemic was the possibility that it might ultimately improve the medical understanding and treatment of a class of chronic conditions that had affected millions of people long before the coronavirus arrived, giving a voice and a research infrastructure to forms of suffering that had previously existed, largely in the shadows of medical recognition. Historical and scientific details throughout, drawn from WHO timeline records, CDC pandemic documentation, Northwestern Medicine timeline, long COVID clinical research published in The Lancet, WHO long COVID fact sheet, and PMC research on long COVID definitions. In the years following the formal end of the public health emergency of international concern, the world began the long and imperfect work of trying to understand what had happened to it, not only in the statistical sense of counting the dead and measuring the economic contraction and cataloguing the policy decisions that had been made under extraordinary pressure and with incomplete information, but in the deeper and more complicated sense of asking what the pandemic had revealed about the societies through which it had moved, about the structures of inequality and solidarity that had shaped its unequal impact, about the institutions of global health governance that had been tested in ways they had not been tested before. The process of retrospective assessment was, by its nature, a contentious one. The decisions that governments had made in the heat of the emergency, the lockdowns and school closures and vaccine mandates and mask requirements, were now being revisited in a calmer atmosphere and with the benefit of hindsight, and the evaluations were not always favorable. Some analysts argued that the most restrictive interventions had caused harms to the education and development of children, to the mental health of isolated populations, to the economic circumstances of workers in industries that had been shuttered, that were not fully accounted for in the public health calculus that had justified them. Others argued that the restrictions had been necessary and had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost, and that the counterfactual, what would have happened without the measures taken, was an essential part of any honest assessment. These debates were genuinely complex, genuinely unresolved, and genuinely important, and they unfolded in academic journals and parliamentary inquiries and newspaper opinion pages, and the quieter conversations of families who had been affected in different ways, some grieving the loss of relatives who had died of COVID-19, others grieving the loss of years of their children's education, others still grieving the loss of businesses and livelihoods, and the retirement savings that had dissolved in the economic disruption of the early pandemic. In the United Kingdom, a formal public inquiry into the pandemic response, the UK COVID-19 inquiry, chaired by Baroness Heather Hallett, began hearing evidence in 2023 and would continue its work for several years, receiving testimony from government ministers, scientific advisors, healthcare workers, and bereaved families, attempting to construct a comprehensive account of the decisions that had been made and the lessons that should be drawn for future preparedness. In the United States, a similarly ambitious effort was made by a bipartisan congressional commission to examine the origins of the pandemic, the federal response, and the failures that had been identified, though the political context in which such inquiries necessarily operated made the achievement of genuine bipartisan consensus on the most contested questions difficult. In the quiet and patient way that history processes its most significant events, the COVID-19 pandemic was entering the long process of becoming a subject of historical understanding rather than lived experience, a transition that would take years and perhaps generations to complete. The question of the pandemic's origins, where and how SARS-CoV-2 had first crossed from an animal population into human beings, remained, in the years following the emergency, one of the most consequential and contested unresolved questions in the history of infectious disease investigation. The two principal hypotheses that had been discussed since the early months of the pandemic were, in essence, a natural spillover hypothesis, which proposed that the virus had emerged through the kind of zoonotic transmission event that had been responsible for most of the major viral outbreaks of the preceding decades, in which a virus circulating in an animal reservoir, most likely bats, possibly via an intermediate host, had made contact with a human being in circumstances that allowed it to establish and then spread within the human population, and a laboratory-related incident hypothesis, which proposed that the virus had originated in a research setting, most likely the Wuhan Institute of Virology, either through an accident involving naturally collected viral samples, or through some form of research activity that had created or enhanced the virus's capability to infect human beings. The scientific community and the intelligence community had, over the years following the initial outbreak, reached different provisional conclusions on this question, and it had not been fully resolved. The WHO's investigation, conducted with limitations imposed by the accessibility of early data and the constraints of international cooperation with Chinese authorities, had concluded in 2021 that a laboratory origin was extremely unlikely, but had not ruled it out entirely. A subsequent proposal for a more thorough independent investigation was met with resistance from China, which declined to share the primary data from the early phase of the outbreak that international investigators considered essential for a definitive determination. The United States intelligence community was divided. The FBI and the Department of Energy had assessed with low to moderate confidence that a laboratory-related incident was the more likely explanation, while 4 other agencies and the National Intelligence Council assessed a natural origin as more likely, and the CIA remained undecided. This division within the intelligence community and the absence of the raw data that would be required to resolve the question with certainty meant that the origins of COVID-19 remained, as of the mid-2020s, genuinely uncertain. A state of epistemic incompleteness that was frustrating to scientists, significant for policy, and important for the future of international agreements governing biosafety and research on potentially dangerous pathogens. It is worth noting, with the careful equanimity that this kind of uncertainty deserves, that the question of origin, while important for understanding and preventing future pandemics, did not change the fundamental biological facts about the virus itself. Its structure, its behavior, its clinical effects, or the reality of the suffering it caused were the same regardless of how it had come to enter the human population. The pandemic had happened, and its consequences were real, regardless of where it had begun. The scientific legacy of the COVID-19 pandemic was, alongside its toll of suffering, one of the most significant and lasting aspects of what the world had lived through, and it would be a disservice to the patient work of thousands of researchers to pass over it without the attention it deserves. The pandemic accelerated the development and validation of mRNA vaccine technology in a way that would have lasting consequences for medicine far beyond COVID-19 itself. Having demonstrated that mRNA vaccines could be designed rapidly, manufactured at scale, and administered safely to billions of people, the scientific community had acquired a platform with potential applications that extended to influenza, respiratory syncytial virus, HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, and a range of cancers. And the investment that had poured into mRNA technology during the pandemic was now being directed toward these applications with an energy and a resource base that would not have existed without the extraordinary circumstances of 2020 and 2021. BioNTech, the German company that had spent a decade developing mRNA as a cancer therapy, before pivoting to COVID-19 in January 2020, was by 2023 and 2024 in advanced clinical trials of mRNA-based cancer vaccines, tailored to individual patients' tumor profiles, an approach that held the possibility of transforming the treatment of certain cancers in a way that the COVID-19 pandemic had not created but had significantly accelerated. The Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, developed using the viral vector technology that had been pioneered at Oxford's Jenner Institute, represented another technological advance, with applications beyond COVID-19, and the supply agreements that AstraZeneca had negotiated to provide doses at cost to lower-income countries had, for all the regulatory complexities and rare adverse events that had generated headlines, contributed to a substantial reduction in COVID-19 mortality in parts of the world where access to the more expensive mRNA vaccines had been limited. The antivirals developed during the pandemic, Paxlovid and Molnupiravir, added to the toolkit available for managing respiratory viral infections and contributed to the research programs that were exploring antiviral drugs, a broader class of medicines for infectious diseases that had previously had no specific treatment. The extraordinary investment in COVID-19 diagnostics had also produced rapid advances in the technology of point-of-care testing, the lateral flow tests that had become a familiar part of daily life in many countries during the pandemic, and in the genomic surveillance infrastructure that had been built to track variants, an infrastructure that would retain value for monitoring the evolution of influenza, respiratory syncytial virus, and any future pathogen of concern. The pandemic had, in this sense, compressed a decade of progress in several areas of medicine into 3 years, driven by the combination of scientific urgency, political will, and financial resources that a global health emergency makes available in ways that ordinary research funding cycles do not. The social and cultural landscape that the pandemic left behind was one that would take much longer to fully map and understand, because the effects of such a pervasive disruption to ordinary life were embedded in the fabric of daily experience in ways that were not always easy to measure or articulate, but that were nonetheless real and lasting. The mental health consequences of the pandemic were among the most widely documented and most serious of these effects. Studies published in the years following the acute phase consistently found elevated rates of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and complicated grief in populations around the world, with the burden falling disproportionately on those who had been most directly affected by loss, by the experience of serious illness, by the isolation of prolonged lockdown, or by the particular stresses of being a healthcare worker during the acute crisis. Healthcare workers, in particular, carried the weight of what they had witnessed and endured during the worst periods of the pandemic. The physicians and nurses and respiratory, therapists and hospital porters who had worked in overwhelmed and under-resourced environments, who had held the hands of dying patients, whose families could not be present, who had made difficult decisions under conditions of extreme uncertainty, who had themselves been ill or had lost colleagues and friends. And the rates of burnout, moral injury, and post-traumatic stress in this group were, by the studies that emerged from the years following the acute phase, substantially elevated relative to pre-pandemic levels. The pandemic had also produced a significant disruption to educational trajectories, particularly for children and young people who had experienced extended periods of school closure, with data suggesting that the lost learning time had produced measurable setbacks in literacy and numeracy that were most pronounced in children from lower income families and in younger children whose foundational skills had been disrupted at a critical developmental period. The working patterns of many industries had been permanently altered by the experience of remote work. The rapid and largely successful transition to home-based work in 2020 had demonstrated that many tasks previously assumed to require physical presence in an office could be performed effectively at a distance, and many workers and employers had arrived at new hybrid arrangements in the years following the pandemic that represented a genuine and lasting change in the geography of work. Cities whose downtown cores had depended on the daily influx of office workers found themselves adapting to a world in which those workers came in less frequently, with consequences for the businesses, transit systems, and urban economies that had been organized around the assumption of the daily commute. The unequal burden of the pandemic, the manner in which its harms had fallen more heavily on people who were already disadvantaged by poverty, by structural racism, by precarious employment, by inadequate housing, by limited access to healthcare, was one of the most persistently and painfully documented features of the entire experience. And it became, in the years following the acute phase, a central theme in discussions about public health, social policy, and the moral obligations of wealthy societies toward their most vulnerable members. In the United States, data compiled by the CDC and independent researchers showed that Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous Americans had experienced significantly higher rates of COVID-19 infection, hospitalization, and death than white Americans, a disparity that reflected the intersection of occupational exposure. Essential workers disproportionately drawn from communities of color, with the health consequences of chronic conditions that were themselves more prevalent in those communities as a result of historical and ongoing inequities in income, housing, education, environmental quality, and healthcare access. In India, the Delta wave of spring 2021 had revealed with particular clarity the catastrophic consequences of a pandemic meeting, a healthcare system that had been chronically underfunded relative to the scale of the population it served, with the collapse of oxygen supplies in hospitals that was one of the most devastating features of that wave, reflecting not a sudden and unpredictable failure, but the accumulated result of years of insufficient investment in public health infrastructure. Globally, the COVAX facility's shortfall in delivering vaccines to lower-income countries in 2021, a failure attributable to a combination of manufacturing constraints, export restrictions imposed by vaccine-producing nations, advance purchase agreements that had concentrated doses in wealthy nations, and the intellectual property frameworks governing the production of patented vaccines, was, in the assessment of many global health experts, one of the most significant policy failures of the pandemic response, both in its direct consequences for the populations that were left without vaccine access and in its indirect consequences for the course of the pandemic, since continued uncontrolled transmission in unvaccinated populations provided the conditions in which variants like Delta and Omicron arose and spread. The pandemic had, in this way, provided an unusually vivid and well-documented demonstration of a principle that public health professionals had been articulating for decades, that global health security is indivisible, that an infectious disease circulating anywhere in an interconnected world is a potential threat to people everywhere, and that the equity of access to the tools of disease prevention and treatment is not merely a moral aspiration, but an epidemiological necessity. The question of pandemic preparedness, what the world had learned, and what it intended to do differently in anticipation of the next pandemic, occupied a central place in the discussions of global health institutions, governments, and research communities in the years following the acute phase of COVID-19. And it is a question that belongs in any complete account of this period, not because the answers are simple or settled, but because the asking of it reflects the most important practical legacy of everything the world had been through. The negotiations toward a global pandemic treaty, formerly known as the Pandemic Agreement, were conducted under the auspices of the WHO beginning in 2021 and continued through the mid-2020s, attempting to establish binding international commitments on pathogen surveillance, early warning systems, equitable access to vaccines and therapeutics, and the strengthening of health systems in lower-income countries that had been most vulnerable to the consequences of inadequate healthcare infrastructure during the COVID-19 pandemic. The negotiations were complex and often slow, reflecting the genuine difficulty of reconciling the interests of countries at very different levels of development with very different existing capacities and with different assessments of how the burdens and benefits of a more robust international health security system should be distributed. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, known as CEPI, had set an ambitious goal following the COVID-19 experience of being able to develop a safe and effective vaccine against any new pathogen within 100 days of its identification, a goal that, if achieved, would represent a dramatic compression of the development timelines that had defined even the remarkable COVID-19 vaccine achievement. And that would require sustained investment in platform technologies, manufacturing capacity, and regulatory preparedness that went well beyond what had existed in 2019. The World Bank established a financial intermediary fund for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response in 2022, intended to fill some of the funding gaps that had been identified in global pandemic preparedness, providing resources for the strengthening of surveillance systems and laboratory networks in lower-income countries that were the most important early warning systems for the emergence of novel pathogens. Whether these institutional responses would prove adequate to the challenge of future pandemics, whether the attention and resources that were available in the years immediately following COVID-19, when the memory of what inadequate preparedness had cost was still vivid, would be sustained through the years of diminishing urgency that typically follow major crises, was a question that remained genuinely open, dependent on the political will and institutional memory of a world that had demonstrated, over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, both its remarkable capacity for collective action and its equally remarkable capacity for the kind of institutional complacency that allows preventable disasters to occur. The personal testimonies of the pandemic, the diaries and memoirs and journalistic accounts and oral history, projects that were produced during and after the crisis, constituted a kind of collective document of extraordinary breadth, a record of how ordinary life had felt from the inside during a global upheaval, and they are worth pausing to acknowledge with the attention that individual human experience always deserves, even in an account that is necessarily concerned with the large patterns of history, rather than the particular texture of any single life. There were the physicians who wrote of the feeling of removing their protective equipment after a long shift, of the physical weight of the N95 mask against their face, and the particular relief of stepping outside into cold air after hours in a hot ward, and of the difficulty of leaving behind, when they went home to their families, what they had witnessed during those hours. There were the teachers who described the strange experience of teaching to a grid of small faces on a laptop screen, of trying to hold the attention and support the learning of 30 children through the flat interface of a video call, of worrying about the children whose faces appeared on the screen, looking tired or anxious, or whose home backgrounds suggested circumstances that made studying at home difficult or impossible. There were the nursing home workers who described the particular sorrow of the early pandemic in their facilities when family members could not visit, when residents whose cognitive impairment made it impossible for them to understand why their children did not come, sat by windows and waited, and when the workers who cared for them tried to fill the space left by absent families with a presence and an attention that was real but could not substitute for what was missing. There were the parents of young children who wrote of the strange compression of home and work, of managing childcare and professional obligations in the same space simultaneously, of the particular exhaustion of that compression, and also, in some accounts, of the unexpected gifts of it, of the slow mornings and the games in the garden, and the sense of a family drawn more tightly together by the removal of the external demands that had previously scattered its members in different directions from early morning to late evening. And there were the people living alone, particularly the elderly and the young, for whom the lockdowns produced a kind of isolation that the word itself does not quite capture. Not simply the absence of company, but the absence of the incidental human contact that normally threads through daily life, and whose importance becomes apparent only when it is removed. The brief exchanges with strangers on public transport, the shared glance at something amusing in the street, the unconscious calibration of one's sense of self that comes from being seen and acknowledged by others in the ordinary transactions of a shared world. As the years moved past the acute phase of the pandemic and into the quieter work of recovery and reflection, the scientific understanding of long COVID continued to deepen, and with it came the first tentative signs of therapeutic progress that offered some hope to the many millions of people still living with its effects. Research published in 2023 and 2024 from centers including the National Institutes of Health in the United States, University College London, and the FOSS-COVID Consortium in the United Kingdom, began to identify biological markers that distinguished patients with long COVID from those who had recovered fully, providing objective evidence for a condition that had sometimes been questioned, particularly in its early period, by clinicians who were unfamiliar with its presentation and who found it difficult to reconcile with the absence of clear abnormalities on standard investigations. Studies found evidence of persistent viral antigen in the gut tissue of some long COVID patients months after the initial infection, supporting the viral reservoir hypothesis. Other studies found characteristic patterns of immune dysregulation, including low levels of cortisol and abnormalities in certain T-cell populations, that distinguished long COVID patients from healthy controls and from patients who had recovered fully from acute COVID-19. The development of reliable biomarkers opened the possibility of clinical trials that could objectively measure the effect of potential treatments, a prerequisite for the kind of evidence-based therapeutic development that could eventually produce validated treatments for the condition. Early clinical trials of a range of interventions, including anticoagulants targeting the microclot hypothesis, antiviral drugs targeting residual viral persistence, and immune modulators targeting the inflammatory dysregulation, were underway by 2024, though none had yet produced results of sufficient quality to establish a standard of care. The long COVID clinics that had been established in hospitals around the world provided multidisciplinary care, bringing together physicians, physiotherapists, psychologists, and occupational therapists, that offered structured support to patients navigating a condition with no clear treatment algorithm, and the peer support networks that patients had built through social media and patient organizations continued to provide a form of community and shared knowledge that many patients described as essential to managing their experience of a condition that remained poorly understood by much of the healthcare system. The relationship between COVID-19 and what researchers were calling post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 infection extended as the years of research accumulated beyond the specific syndrome of long COVID to encompass a broader set of associations between COVID-19 infection and subsequent health conditions that were attracting significant scientific attention. Studies published in high-impact journals in 2022, 2023, and 2024 found associations between COVID-19 infection and elevated subsequent risk of cardiovascular events, including heart attack and stroke, findings that were consistent with the evidence of vascular damage and microclot formation that had been identified as potential mechanisms. Research into the neurological consequences of COVID-19 found elevated rates of cognitive decline, dementia diagnoses, and psychiatric conditions, including new-onset depression and anxiety, in the months and years following infection, with studies using large population databases able to demonstrate these associations with a statistical robustness that made them difficult to dismiss as artifacts of the particular populations being studied. Hypothesis that COVID-19 infection might accelerate the accumulation of pathological changes in the brain associated with Alzheimer's disease and other dementias through mechanisms involving neuroinflammation, vascular injury, and potentially the direct effects of the virus on brain tissue, was being explored by several research groups, and while the evidence was not yet conclusive, its implications were considered sufficiently serious to warrant substantial ongoing investigation. These findings, taken together, suggested that the long-term health consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic might extend well beyond the duration of the acute phase, with the infections of 2020, 2021, and 2022 potentially contributing to an elevated burden of cardiovascular disease, neurological conditions, and mental health disorders in the years and decades that followed. A delayed echo of the pandemic that would be superimposed on the already existing trends in chronic disease that had been a concern of public health before the coronavirus arrived. It is worth noting, with the equanimity that characterizes good science, that these associations, while real and concerning, do not mean that every person who was infected with SARS-CoV-2 will experience these outcomes. They represent elevated population-level risks, and the absolute risk for any individual is shaped by many factors, including the severity of their initial infection, their vaccination status, their age and pre-existing health conditions, and circumstances that remain to be fully understood. The question of what COVID-19 meant for the relationship between human beings and the microbial world they inhabit is one that invites a kind of philosophical reflection that is, in its nature, inconclusive, but nonetheless worth the brief and gentle attention of a few unhurried moments. Human beings have coexisted with viruses for as long as there have been human beings. The evolutionary record contains evidence of ancient viral integrations into the human genome, silent remnants of encounters between our ancestors and pathogens that are now simply part of the genetic material that makes us who we are, written into our cells in a language that only scientists can read. The coronaviruses that circulate as common colds are themselves, by some accounts, former novel pathogens that arrived in human populations as alarming and unfamiliar presences before the slow process of mutual adaptation between host and pathogen settled them into their current benign familiarity. A possibility that offers a kind of long historical perspective on the trajectory of SARS-CoV-2, even as it provides no comfort for those who suffered in the shorter term. The emergence of COVID-19 from an animal reservoir, whatever the specific pathway, reflected the same broad set of conditions that had driven the emergence of SARS, MERS, Ebola, HIV, and the novel influenza strains of the 20th century. The contraction of the distance between human populations and the wild animal populations, in which novel viruses circulate through the expansion of agriculture into previously wild habitats, through the wildlife trade, through the growth of dense urban populations in close geographic proximity to the ecosystems that harbor the greatest diversity of animal-associated viruses. These are, in the deepest sense, consequences of the particular form of civilization that human beings have built over the past several centuries. A civilization of extraordinary achievement and equally extraordinary ecological consequence, one that has brought billions of people out of poverty while simultaneously transforming the conditions under which novel pathogens can emerge and spread. The pandemic did not resolve these underlying conditions, and the emergence of future novel pathogens remains, in the assessment of virtually all serious epidemiologists and evolutionary biologists, not a matter of if, but of when. A recognition that is not meant to frighten, but to motivate the patient and sustained work of preparedness that is the only honest response to what the world has learned. The memory of the pandemic will settle, as all memories settle, into layers, some vivid and accessible, some dimming with time, some preserved in the formal structures of historical record, and some living only in the bodies and minds of those who were there, in the particular way that lived experience is always richer and stranger and more specific than any account of it can be. The year 2020 will be remembered as the year that the world stopped. Not literally, because nothing ever literally stops, but in the sense that the particular rhythm of modern life, the constant motion of people and goods and capital and ideas across the borders, and the time zones of an interconnected planet was interrupted in a way that had no precedent in the experience of anyone alive. The years 2021 and 2022 will be remembered as the years of the vaccines and the variants, of the extraordinary achievement of science and the persistence of the virus, of the cautious and uneven and contested return to something resembling ordinary life. The years that followed will be remembered as the years of reckoning, with the losses that had been sustained, with the inequalities that had been revealed, with the science of long COVID and the science of preparedness, and the slow institutional work of trying to build something more resilient from what the pandemic had laid bare. The healthcare workers who staffed the ICUs during the worst weeks will carry those weeks with them in the particular way that extreme experience is carried, not always consciously, not always painfully, but present, woven into the texture of who they are now, inseparable from the understanding of human fragility and human resilience that they acquired in those rooms. The children who were young during the lockdowns will carry a particular relationship to solitude and screen time, and the indoors and the outdoors, that they may not fully articulate, but that shapes them nonetheless. The bereaved will carry their grief, which does not diminish on any schedule, but follows its own slow and individual path through the years. And the scientists, the epidemiologists and virologists and immunologists and clinicians who spent those years in a state of urgent, collective, often sleepless attention to a virus that was changing everything, will carry the memory of what it felt like to do science at the edge of the possible, under the greatest pressure and with the greatest consequence, and to find that the knowledge they had spent their careers building was, in that moment, exactly what the world needed. And so the pandemic recedes now, as you rest here, into the longer story of which it was a part. The long, slow story of human beings and the invisible world, of the microbes that have always shared this planet with us, sometimes peacefully and sometimes not, of the suffering that disease has always brought, and the knowledge that suffering has always, eventually, generated of the remarkable capacity of the human mind, when turned with sufficient care and sufficient resources toward a problem, to understand it and to find within that understanding some measure of relief. The city of Wuhan is quiet again. Its markets and its bridges and its wide rivers return to the rhythms of ordinary life. The streets that were empty in January 2020, full again, of the sound and movement of 11 million people going about the unremarkable and precious businessness of their daily existence. Somewhere in a laboratory, a scientist is bending over a microscope, looking at something small and full of implication, the way scientists always have been and always will be, patient and curious and unhurried in the long work of understanding. The vaccines that were developed in those extraordinary 12 months of 2020 sit in refrigerators in clinics, in countries you have never visited, protecting people you will never meet, a quiet and distributed gift from the science of one difficult year to the bodies of a world that needed it. The people who were ill and recovered are going about their lives. The people who were ill and did not recover are held in the memories of those who loved them, which is where the dead have always lived. in the warm and persistent memory of the living who carry them forward through time. And here you are, in your bed, in your quiet room, breathing slowly, your body heavy and warm, the past dissolving gently at the edges of your attention like fog in morning light. The story has been told. The history is complete. Let it settle now. Let it drift. Let the names and the dates, and the maps and the microscopes, and the vaccine vials, and the overcrowded wards, and the empty streets, the bread being baked in quiet kitchens, all drift away together, gently, into the soft and uncomplicated darkness where there is nothing to know, and nothing to remember, and nothing to do but rest. You are here. You are safe. The past is the past, and you are here.